Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Highland Mystery. Oliver here. There is nothing more flattering or more dangerous than a stranger who truly listens. When a charming radio producer arrives in a lonely Highland hamlet to record forgotten memories, he quickly discovers that every villager has a secret they are desperate to share. But in a place where gossip travels faster than the mist off the sea loch, a private confession can easily become a very lethal weapon. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you like what I'm doing here. Tell us where you are and what time it is in the comments. Now, turn off the lights and let's get started tonight. Chapter 1. The Fog Signal House. Hamish Macbeth sat in the small police station in Lochs and looked with deep resentment at a ceramic bowl. It contained oats, a clear spoonful of honey, and thinly sliced fruit. Priscilla Halberton Smythe had visited the station the day before. She had quietly removed his usual breakfast provisions and replaced them with what she called a sensible start to the morning. Hamish felt a sudden heavy gloom. Priscilla was constantly trying to improve him, steering him toward a respectable future with smarter habits and better meals. It made Hamish feel as if his own life was being tidied completely out of his hands. He pushed the bowl away. He longed for a greasy, warm bacon roll from Patel's general store. He would even have settled for the heavy fried eggs they served in the gloomy police canteen over in Strathbane. Anything was better than sensible oats. On the floor, near the small electric heater, Lugs was sprawled like an old hearth rug. The dog twitched one ear, completely asleep and entirely unbothered by human problems. Hamish needed an excuse to leave the station before he was tempted to complain. He opened his logbook. There was a minor note about a blocked driveway down at Murnish Ferry. It was a weather-beaten hamlet on the edge of a black sea loch, built largely around an old fog signal house. It was just far enough away to count as official duty. He stepped outside and locked the station door. The damp morning light hung low over the village. A cold wind blew off the water, carrying the sharp scent of salt and tangled kelp. The loch itself looked dark and heavy under the clouds. Up on the harbour wall, Sunsea the wildcat sat perfectly still. Her fierce, untamed yellow eyes watched Hamish for a brief moment before she slipped quietly away into the thick heather. Hamish climbed into his Land Rover and drove the winding coastal road toward the ferry. Sound carried strangely over the loch in this damp weather, but gossip travelled even faster. Before Hamish had even left Lochs, the village network was already buzzing. Nessie Curry had been holding court in the queue at Patel's store, loudly informing Mrs. Wellington that a handsome man from London had rented the old fog signal house to ask personal questions. Jessie Curry had echoed her sister, insisting the man was there to steal local secrets. When Hamish arrived in Murnish Ferry, the parking dispute had long since vanished. He parked near the water and walked down the wet stone path to the fog signal house to introduce himself. The heavy wooden door stood open. Inside, a man in a very well-cut tweed jacket was surrounded by 3 local women. This was Adrian Quill. He was a radio producer, gathering vanishing Highland voices for a prestigious broadcast. Adrian was handsome without seeming to try, but what truly struck Hamish was the man's absolute attention. Adrian did not just listen politely, he focused on the women completely. "It is the exact way you remember it that matters, Mrs. Campbell," Adrian said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and warm. "The world is moving so fast. If we do not record these true voices now, they will simply disappear." The women, who were usually deeply suspicious of strangers from the south, were practically glowing. Adrian offered them a rare and intoxicating gift. He made them feel profoundly important. Hamish knocked once on the open doorframe and stepped into the room. "Good morning. I am Police Constable Hamish Macbeth." Adrian looked up and smiled easily. He excused himself from the women and stepped away from his complicated recording equipment. "Ah, the local law. Adrian Quill. It is a pleasure to meet you, Constable. I hope my little project is not causing a disturbance." "Just making introductions," Hamish said softly. His eyes moved over the large wooden table. It was covered in neat stacks of audio cassettes, lined up like little plastic soldiers. "I am collecting oral histories," Adrian explained. "Every life in this village is a remarkable story, Constable. They just need someone to finally listen to them." Hamish watched as Adrian reached into a small cardboard box. The producer pulled out a narrow violet cassette label. One corner of the violet label had been deliberately clipped off with a pair of scissors. Adrian peeled the paper, backing away, and smoothed the colourful sticker onto a fresh tape. "What is the purple one for?" Hamish asked. Adrian tapped the clipped corner of the label with his pen. "These are for private material. Some stories are deeply personal, not meant for the general broadcast. People tell me things in confidence, and I respect that. The clipped violet label reminds me never to share them publicly." Hamish nodded slowly. It sounded incredibly professional and considerate. Yet, as he watched Adrian turn his bright, attentive smile back to the local women, Hamish felt a sudden itch of unease. The man was entirely too polished, and the lonely village of Muinish Ferry was already listening to him far too closely. Chapter 2. Every woman a solo. By Wednesday afternoon, the small village of Lochs was vibrating with a steady, electric current of gossip. Hamish Macbeth stood inside Patel's general store, waiting for a freshly heated meat pie and listening to the local intelligence network operate at full capacity. Near the tinned peaches, the Curry sisters were holding court. Nessie Curry wore her usual thick glasses and identical camel hair coat, leaning forward with the intense focus of a wartime strategist. "I have it on very good authority," Nessie announced to the shop at large, "that Myri Kinnear, over at Muinish, bought a brand new pink blouse on a Tuesday, and she wore it to the post office." "A Tuesday, aye," Jessie Curry echoed, shaking her head grimly. "Shameless behaviour for a Tuesday." "It is that radio man," Nessie continued, ignoring her sister. "Mr. Quill. He is asking them all about their feelings. He has the women over there queuing up at the hairdresser's parlour like they are going to meet the Queen. Mark my words. Vanity is a terrible thing when it has been starved." Hamish collected his warm, heavy pie in a paper bag. It was a proper, greasy comfort, a vast improvement over the sensible oats Priscilla had forced upon him. At his feet, Lugs was sprawled like an old hearthrug, completely indifferent to the moral decay of the neighbouring hamlet. The dog only lifted his head when a flake of crust tumbled onto the linoleum floor, snapping it up with a lazy snap of his jaws before resting his chin back on his paws. Hamish left the store and decided to take a drive. He needed to see this sudden bloom of vanity for himself. The road to Muinish Ferry was draped in a thick, rolling mist. It clung to the dark green hills and settled low over the black surface of the sea loch. The air smelled strongly of peat smoke, damp wool, and the bitter scent of old rain. It was the sort of heavy, isolated afternoon that usually kept Highlanders firmly indoors by their firesides. Yet, when Hamish parked near the ferry slipway, Muinish was surprisingly active. The change in the village was obvious and slightly unsettling. Women who had long settled into comfortable, practical habits were suddenly walking with a different posture. Hamish spotted Myri Kinnear, the widowed ferry booking clerk, standing outside her small wooden office. Nessie had been right. Myri was wearing a bright pink blouse beneath her cardigan, and her hair looked freshly set. She was smiling at nothing in particular, staring out over the water with a dreamy expression. Down by the harbour wall, the men presented a stark contrast. A group of fishermen stood in a tight knot, their hands shoved deep into their pockets. Rab Sutherland, a broad-shouldered boatman with a notoriously short temper, scowled as Hamish approached. "Looking for the London fellow, Hamish?" Rab muttered, kicking roughly at a coiled mooring rope. "Just taking the air, Rab," Hamish said mildly. "Is he causing trouble?" "He is causing a circus," Rab spat. "My wife spent an hour in front of the mirror this morning because that man wants to ask her about baking bread in the old days. Suddenly, making a loaf of bread is high art. The man has a smooth tongue, and it is making everyone look like fools." Hamish nodded sympathetically. He walked quietly up the path toward the post office. Through the glass window, he saw Adrian Quill standing near the counter. The radio producer was speaking softly to Catriona Bell, the quiet, middle-aged postmistress. Adrian leaned in close, his posture entirely focused on her. Catriona's cheeks were flushed, and she was nodding eagerly. Hamish realized that Adrian was not merely collecting local history. He was rearranging the entire emotional landscape of the village. He did not flirt crudely. Instead, he offered each woman the far more intoxicating illusion that she was the only one who truly understood him. Later that evening, Hamish drove up to the Tommel Castle Hotel. The luxury hotel, owned by Priscilla's parents, always made Hamish feel large and clumsy. He walked into the plush, overly warm lounge, hoping to find Priscilla and escape the damp chill in his bones. He found her sitting at a small table, nursing a cup of tea. She looked elegant and entirely unruffled, her smooth golden hair catching the light from the chandeliers. To Hamish's surprise, Adrian Quill was sitting in the armchair opposite her, holding a delicate crystal glass of gin. Hamish paused by the doorway, observing them. "You are a fascinating study, Miss Halberton Smythe," Adrian was saying in his warm, perfectly modulated voice. "You manage everyone else's expectations beautifully. You arrange the hotel, you manage your family, you even manage the local policeman. But who do you allow to listen to your own chaos?" Priscilla set her teacup down with a quiet, decisive clink. She gave Adrian a frosty, polite smile that did not reach her clear eyes. "I prefer to keep my chaos entirely to myself, Mr. Quill. It requires no broadcast." Adrian chuckled, undeterred, and took a sip of his gin. He caught sight of Hamish and raised his glass in a cheerful salute before excusing himself to speak with the hotel manager. Hamish walked over and took the empty armchair. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness, though he kept his face pleasantly blank. "He is a very busy man, our Mr. Quill." "He is intrusive," Priscilla said smoothly. "He picks locks in people's minds, Hamish. And he does it simply to see if he can." She picked up a tiny, perfectly square cucumber sandwich from a silver tray, looked at it with mild distaste, and set it back down. "He makes people feel as though they are the centre of the universe. It is a very dangerous trick." "Mary Kinnear certainly thinks she is the centre of it," Hamish murmured. "She told me earlier that Adrian promised her story would be the anchor of his entire programme. He told her she had the one true voice of the loch." Priscilla raised a delicate eyebrow. "How interesting." "Because I overheard him tell the hotel receptionist the exact same thing not an hour ago." Hamish sat back, resting his long legs in front of him. The pieces were beginning to align in his mind. Adrian was harvesting secrets by making identical promises. He was dealing in vanity, promising different women different kinds of supreme importance in the final broadcast. It was a clever method for a radio producer, but it was a disastrous strategy for a man living in a small, tight-knit community. "He is playing a dangerous game," Hamish said softly, staring into the empty fireplace. "Vanity is a quiet thing when it is ignored. But once you feed it, it gets terribly angry when you take the plate away." The village of Muirnish Ferry was waiting for the grand listening party Adrian had promised for the end of the week. Hamish felt a familiar, cold weight settling in his stomach. The village was humming with expectation, but Hamish knew that when too many women were promised the solo, the resulting chorus would be entirely out of tune. Chapter 3. The Listening Night. The Muirnish Community Hall smelled intensely of damp wool, strong floor wax, and the metallic heat of two large tea urns. Outside, a relentless Highland rain battered the tin roof. Hamish had seen Sunsy on his way in. The wildcat had been sitting on a slick stone wall, her fierce yellow eyes flashing in his headlights before she vanished into the wet heather. Inside the hall, Hamish took a seat in the back row. Under his folding chair, Lugs immediately sprawled flat like an old hearth rug. The dog closed his eyes, completely ignoring the scrape of chairs and the loud chatter of the village. A local woman handed Hamish a paper cup of bitter tea and a plate of dreadfully dry digestive biscuits. He accepted them politely. His stomach, however, longed for the thick, comforting plates of pasta served at Willie Lamont's restaurant back in Lochs. Even Angela Brodie's famously heavy scones would have been better than these dusty crumbs. The room was packed. The village gossip network was in full attendance. Nessie and Jessie Curry had secured seats in the second row. Nessie was leaning over the aisle to inform Mrs. Wellington that Mary Kinnear looked terribly nervous. Jessie nodded rapidly in agreement, her camel-hair coat rustling loudly. The air was thick with the dangerous energy of people waiting to hear themselves praised. Adrian Quill stood at the front of the hall. He looked effortlessly handsome in a dark sweater. A large reel-to-reel tape machine sat on a folding table beside him. He thanked the village for their honesty and pressed the heavy play button. First, the machine played gentle stories of fishing and old winter storms. The room murmured with pleased recognition. Then, the tone shifted. Adrian had edited the tapes with a cruel, surgical precision. A snippet of a local farmer complaining about his brother was cut tightly against a clip of the brother's wife discussing a suspicious family will. The room grew very still. Then came a recording of a fisherman's wife. She spoke softly about her husband's drinking, but her words had been edited to sound almost mocking. A few younger men sniggered loudly in the back row. Rab Sutherland stood up, his face dark red with fury, and walked out into the rain. Adrian played a short, deeply sorrowful clip of a woman mourning a private mistake. Hamish recognised Mary Kinnear's voice. The raw grief had been polished into a dramatic, artistic flourish for the radio. Mary sat frozen in the third row, her face completely pale. Adrian simply smiled. He smoothed over the heavy silence with his warm, charming voice, thanking them all for their profound contributions to history. The meeting broke up quickly. The polite mask of Muirnish had been completely ripped away. Outside in the cold, wet car park, sound became a weapon. Hamish stood near his Land Rover and watched the damage unfold. A furious row broke out between two women near the main gate. A moment later, two husbands began shoving each other aggressively by the bus stop. Hamish watched Adrian carry his equipment to his car. The producer was walking with a light, energetic step. Hamish realised Adrian was using private material not to make art, but to create emotional leverage. The man was enjoying the chaos he had built. Much later that night, the rain finally stopped. A heavy, dripping silence settled over the loch. Young Niall Kerr, a local boy who was obsessed with electronics, was walking home along the dark harbour path. As he passed the dark bulk of the old fog signal house, Niall stopped. Adrian should have been asleep for hours. The windows were black, but Niall stood perfectly still and listened. He could hear the distinct, rhythmic hiss and click of a tape machine running behind the heavy wooden door. Someone was still awake, cutting voices together in the dark. Chapter 4. A Voice Left Behind. Hamish Macbeth sat at his desk in the Lochs police station, chewing slowly on a piece of painfully dry toast. He had attempted to bake Angela Brodie's recipe for fruit scones the previous evening. Unsurprisingly, they had turned out like small, heavy stones. Angela was a wonderful confidant and a sharp intellectual ally, but she was a notoriously poor cook. Hamish pushed the plate away, wishing he was sitting comfortably in the Napoli restaurant, while Willie Lamont fussed over the tables and served massive bowls of rich pasta. Under the desk, Lugs was fast asleep. The dog was sprawled like an old hearthrug next to the electric heater. He was dreaming, his paws twitching lazily as if he were chasing a very slow rabbit through the heather. The heavy black telephone on the desk rang sharply, shattering the quiet morning. Hamish picked up the receiver. "He has run away," Nessie Curry announced without offering any formal introduction. "The radio man packed his bags and fled before the sun was even up." Before the sun was up, Jessie Curry echoed loudly in the background. "How exactly do you know this, Nessie?" Hamish asked, sighing softly and reaching for his notebook. "Because Mary Kinnear went down to the fog signal house in her new pink blouse and found the door locked and the man gone," Nessie declared with a triumph that bordered on glee. Catriona Bell has a tape he left behind. The man is an absolute coward. He stirred up all that vanity in the women over there, made them feel like movie stars, and simply walked away from the mess. Hamish thanked the Curry sisters for their relentless civic duty and put the telephone down. He collected his uniform cap and walked out to the police Land Rover. The morning was intensely bleak. A thick, grey mist rolled down off the Highland hills, smothering the dark green heather and settling heavily over the black water of the sea loch. The damp air smelled strongly of peat smoke, wet stone, and rotting kelp. It was the kind of atmospheric pause that made the landscape feel ancient and deeply unwelcoming. When Hamish arrived at Muirnish Ferry, the atmosphere of the hamlet was entirely changed. Just yesterday, the village had been buzzing with excitement and nervous energy. Today, it was profoundly subdued. The women who had queued proudly for the hairdresser were now hurrying along the wet paths with their heads bowed deep in their coat collars. The village was humiliated, bereft, and highly defensive. They had offered up their private sorrows to a charming stranger, and the stranger had simply abandoned them. Hamish walked straight to the post office. The bell above the door tinkled cheerfully, offering a sharp contrast to the gloomy mood. The cramped back sorting room smelled of dusty paper and the metallic tang of an electric kettle that never quite reached a boil. Catriona Bell stood behind the main counter. The postmistress looked incredibly pale, her hands resting flat on the worn wood. "Nessie Curry tells me you have a message from Mr. Quill," Hamish said gently, taking off his cap. Catriona did not meet his eyes. She reached beneath the counter and placed a single plastic cassette case on the polished wood. "I found it on the doorstep of the Fog Signal House when I went to deliver his morning letters," she said quietly. Her voice was flat, completely devoid of the eager flush it had held the day before. He left it with an envelope of cash for the postage. Hamish borrowed a small, battered tape player from the shelf behind the counter. He pushed the cassette in and pressed the heavy play button. The warm, polished voice of Adrian Quill filled the small post office. "My apologies to the good people of Muirnish," the recorded voice said smoothly. "I have taken a sudden notion to return south. The city is calling me back. I ask that my recording equipment be boxed up and my papers forwarded to my London office. Thank you all for your wonderful stories." The tape clicked off. Hamish frowned slightly. It was certainly Adrian's voice, but the tone felt entirely wrong. It lacked his usual theatrical flair and careful charm. "Did you see him leave the village, Catriona?" Hamish asked. "No," she replied softly. "Nobody saw him leave. The early ferry was cancelled due to the fog. He must have driven out in the dark while we were all asleep." Hamish thanked her, borrowed the keys to the Fog Signal House, and walked back out into the mist. He followed the village path above the water. The gulls were crying harshly over the flat sea loch. When he reached the heavy wooden door of the Fog Signal House, he unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was freezing. Hamish stood in the centre of the floor and looked around. The feeling of wrongness grew much stronger in his chest. Adrian Quill was a man who loved elegance and careful presentation. Yet this room was a complete disaster. A porcelain teacup sat on the table, a rim of cold brown liquid still inside. A very expensive tweed jacket was tossed carelessly over the back of a wooden chair. Several thick notebooks were scattered across the floor, their pages crumpled. It was not the sort of departure made by a man who loved his own reflection. Hamish walked over to the large wooden table where Adrian kept his recordings. The heavy reel-to-reel tape machine was still plugged into the wall, but the neat, military rows of cassettes had been violently disturbed. Hamish leaned closer. He remembered the narrow violet cassette labels. He remembered Adrian carefully clipping the corner of one to mark a deeply personal, confidential confession. There were several empty plastic cases pushed to the far back of the table. Lying on the floor near the table leg was a tiny, sticky piece of paper. Hamish picked it up. It was the waxy backing of a violet cassette label, peeled off in a massive hurry. The specific tapes that Adrian had marked as strictly private were completely missing. All the rest of his general broadcast material was left behind. Hamish stood up slowly. He looked at the final cassette Catriona had given him. He began to suspect that the departure tape was meant to close the story far too neatly. It was a clever distraction. People who run away suddenly do not stop to dictate polite forwarding instructions while leaving their most valuable private work behind. The voice on the tape was a door slammed shut to stop anyone from looking too closely inside the room. Hamish stepped out of the fog signal house and locked the door behind him. He looked up at the stone wall above the path. Sunsy, the fierce wildcat, was sitting on the top stone. She stared down at him with wild, unblinking yellow eyes before slipping silently into the damp ferns. Hamish looked out over the black loch. The village of Muirnish Ferry sounded much quieter today, but Hamish knew it was a highly dangerous silence. They were not at peace. They were only holding their breath, waiting and listening carefully for what was going to happen next. Chapter 5. The Slipway at Dawn. Hamish Macbeth was standing in his small kitchen, staring mournfully at a cup of instant coffee that tasted faintly of copper wire. He longed fiercely for a thick slice of hot, buttery toast from the back of Patel's general store, but a frantic telephone call at 5 o'clock in the morning had ruined any chance of a comforting breakfast. The voice on the telephone had been Rab Sutherland. The angry boatman had sounded completely hollow. Hamish drove out to Muirnish Ferry through the pale grey light of early dawn. The mist was finally thinning, clinging in thin ribbons to the dark heather. Gulls cried harshly over the still, flat water of the sea loch. The cold air smelled intensely of wet stone and salt. When he reached the stone slipway below the small wooden ferry office, a quiet group of villagers had already gathered. They stood at a respectful distance. Hamish parked the Land Rover. He left Lugg sleeping inside on the passenger seat, sprawled flat like a discarded hearthrug. Hamish walked down the slippery stone steps. Mary Kinnear lay near the dark edge of the water. She looked incredibly small against the hard stones. Hamish felt a deep, heavy sadness. Mary was dressed far too carefully for an ordinary morning errand. She wore her new pink blouse and a heavy, expensive wool coat that she usually saved for Sunday church services. She had clearly expected to meet someone in private. A loud screech of tires broke. A heavy Strathbane police car stopped abruptly at the top of the slipway. Detective Chief Inspector Blair climbed out, slamming the car door. Blair was a heavy, vulgar man, with small, piggy eyes and a face that seemed permanently set in a sneer. He walked down the steps, bringing a strong, unmistakable smell of stale whiskey and sharp peppermints with him. "Right, Macbeth, step back," Blair ordered loudly in his thick Glasgow accent. He barely looked at the poor woman on the stones. "This is obvious. The silly woman came down here in the dark, missed her footing, and hit her head. A clumsy accident." "She is wearing her best clothes, sir," Hamish said softly. "People do not dress like this to look at the water at 5 in the morning. She was coming to meet Mr. Quill." "Quill ran away yesterday," Blair barked, his face turning a dark, angry red. "Do not try to complicate my morning with your absurd Highland intuition." She slipped on the wet stone. "Case closed." Blair turned away to shout orders at his junior officers. Up on the rocky cliff above the ferry office, Sunsy appeared. The wildcat sat perfectly still, her fierce yellow eyes watching the loud Strathbane detectives with absolute disdain. Hamish quietly stepped away from the crowd. He knew Blair was completely wrong. The heavy feeling of wrongness he had felt in the fog signal house was now a terrible reality. He walked up to the small wooden ferry office to inspect the surrounding area. The village gossip network was already moving faster than the official police work. Hamish could hear 2 fishermen muttering that Myrie had received a telephone call very late in the night. The rural party line had clicked, meaning someone else in the village had undoubtedly listened to the conversation. Hamish looked closely at the public telephone shelf mounted on the outside wall of the ferry hut. The black receiver was resting securely in its cradle, but caught in the rough grain of the wooden shelf was a tiny scrap of paper. Hamish carefully picked it up. It was a torn piece of a narrow violet cassette label. It was the exact colour of the labels Adrian Quill used for his strictly private recordings. It had absolutely no business being near the public telephone on the slipway. Hamish folded the tiny scrap of violet paper into his uniform pocket. As he walked back toward his vehicle, A pale figure stepped out from behind the ferry office. It was young Niall Kerr. The boy looked terrified, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "Constable Macbeth," Niall whispered quickly, looking nervously toward Blair. "That tape. The one the radio man left behind at the post office. What about it, Niall?" Hamish asked gently. "There is something terribly odd about it," the boy said, shifting his weight. "I know about electronics. I listen to tape decks all the time. The background noise on that tape is wrong. It jumps." Before Hamish could ask another question, Blair shouted his name from the slipway. Hamish told the boy to go straight home and stay quiet. The loch looked completely blank under the rising sun, but Hamish knew the village was now tied up in a dangerous, invisible web of sound. Chapter 6. Hamish tries to spare a boy. Hamish Macbeth stood quietly near the back of the queue in Patel's general store. He was holding a small, cheerful red tin of Scottish shortbread. He desperately needed something sweet and buttery to erase the lingering memory of the sour, lukewarm stew he had been forced to eat at the Strathbane police canteen the day before. Hamish always preferred simple, local comfort food over the dismal, institutional meals provided by his superiors. The store was incredibly warm and humming with urgent conversation. The village gossip network was moving much faster than the bitter wind outside. Nessie Curry was standing by the fresh vegetables, delivering the morning news to Mrs. Wellington.
He's hiding something
"I saw him with my
entirely
own eyes,"
from the official
Nessie
detectives.
announced in her high,
He's hiding
strident
everything.
voice. Constable Macbeth was whispering with that young Kerr boy behind the ferry office, just after the poor woman was found. "He is hiding something from the official detectives." "Hiding something entirely," Jessie Curry echoed firmly, adjusting her identical camel hair coat. Mr. Patel smiled apologetically at Hamish from behind the counter. Hamish paid for his shortbread, tipped his uniform cap to the ladies, and stepped out into the cold air. The gossip was dangerous, but he had more urgent matters to attend to. He walked up the steep path to a quiet wooden bench positioned high above the harbour road. Young Niall Kerr was already sitting there, looking pale and deeply anxious. As soon as they reached the bench, Lugs collapsed heavily onto the damp grass. The dog sprawled out completely flat, looking exactly like a discarded hearthrug, entirely exhausted by the short uphill walk. Hamish sat down and offered the boy a piece of shortbread. Niall shook his head. "Tell me about the tape, Niall," Hamish said gently. Niall looked nervously down at his shoes. "I collect old tape decks, Constable. I know how magnetic tape sounds. Every room has a specific background hiss when you record in it. A sort of quiet breath." Hamish nodded, encouraging the boy to continue. "On Mr. Quill's departure tape," Niall explained, his voice trembling slightly. "The hiss jumps. It cuts out and restarts in the middle of his sentences. He did not record that message all at once. Someone took old pieces of his voice and spliced them together." Hamish felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The departure was completely fake. Someone had constructed it out of old recordings to make it seem as though Adrian had run away. "You have a very sharp ear, Niall," Hamish said. "Now, I need you to do something for me. I need you to go home and say absolutely nothing about this to anyone." Niall looked surprised. "Not even to the Chief Inspector?" "Especially not to him," Hamish warned. "Detective Chief Inspector Blair was a notorious bully. If Blair got hold of this theory, he would drag Niall into an official interrogation room, shout at him, and make the boy the absolute centre of the village gossip." Hamish wanted to spare the boy from that humiliation. It was a kindly meant instruction, but it was a terrible mistake. A sharp, freezing wind swept down from the green hills, violently shaking the dark heather and whipping the grey loch light into fractured lines across the water. It was a bleak, unforgiving atmosphere, perfectly matching the mood of the village. By early afternoon, Hamish's attempt at kindness had completely unravelled. Niall's mother, Mrs. Kerr, had visited the post office. She had absorbed the toxic rumours spread by the Curry sisters and became terrified that her son was involved in a murder plot. She immediately marched up to the ferry slipway and demanded to speak to the senior officer in charge. Hamish was standing near the harbour wall when Blair finally found him. The heavy Glasgow detective looked purple with rage. "You absolute menace, Macbeth," Blair roared, loud enough for half the village to hear. The smell of stale whiskey and mints preceded him like a physical blow. "You withheld vital witness information. You told a suspect to keep quiet." "He is not a suspect, sir," Hamish said, keeping his voice level and his tone deliberately mild. "He is only a boy with a theory about audio tape." "You are obstructing a murder investigation," Blair shouted, waving a thick finger in Hamish's face. "You are deliberately hiding evidence, because you want the glory for yourself. Keep out of my way, Macbeth, or I will have your uniform." Blair stormed off toward the Kerr house. The damage was done. All along the harbour wall, fishermen and shopkeepers were muttering quietly to one another. Witness confidence completely collapsed. The people of Munich Ferry closed their doors and pulled their curtains tight. In a small, frightened place, Hamish's quiet act of kindness looked exactly like guilty concealment. Chapter 7. The Ferryman's Hands. The snug bar inside the Red Lion pub was intensely warm. Hamish Macbeth sat in a quiet corner, eating a very thick, hot slice of roasted beef with heavy potatoes. It was a wonderful comfort. It was vastly superior to the watery grey soup he was usually forced to endure at the Strathbane police canteen. Under the small wooden table, Lugs was sprawled like an old hearth rug. The dog was completely asleep, ignoring the loud noise of the crowded room. The pub was full of rapid, nervous conversation. The Lochs gossip network had finally crossed the water to Munich Ferry, and it had chosen a firm target. Hamish had just heard Nessie Curry holding court outside the pub window. She had been loudly informing Mrs. Wellington that Rab Sutherland possessed a terrible temper. Inside the pub, the local fishermen were muttering the exact same thing. Rab had been publicly humiliated by the radio producer. That gave the boatman a very clear motive. Hamish finished his meal, left the warm pub, and walked down toward the harbour pier. The weather was worsening rapidly. A bitter rain lashed against the stone path. The dark loch light faded under heavy clouds, and the damp smell of peat smoke was completely blown away by the harsh wind sweeping down from the heather. Up on the slanted roof of the wooden ferry hut, Sunsey sat perfectly still. The wildcat watched the heavy rain with fierce, untamed yellow eyes. Down by the slipway, Detective Chief Inspector Blair was shouting. He had cornered Rab Sutherland against the side of the ferry hut. The broad-shouldered boatman looked furious, his large hands curled into tight fists. Blair loved the simplicity of an easy arrest. The heavy Glasgow detective pointed a thick finger at Rab. "You were angry," Blair yelled, his breath carrying the sharp scent of stale whiskey and mints. "You struck the London man in a rage. You hid him away. And then you silenced the Kinnear woman down here on the stones because she saw you." "I did not touch either of them," Rab growled loudly. "I was drinking in the pub until midnight." "A convenient story," Blair sneered. "You have the strength, Sutherland. You have the temper. It is a very neat package." Hamish stood quietly in the freezing rain and listened. He almost accepted the neat theory himself. Rab certainly looked capable of violence. He had the heavy hands of a man who hauled ropes for a living. Mary Kinnear could have known something dangerous, and Rab could have silenced her. But as Hamish watched Blair prepare to make an official arrest, the theory completely broke apart in his mind. Rab Sutherland was a ferryman. He understood deep water, heavy tides, and diesel engines. Rab did not understand the delicate mechanics of audio tape. Rab could never have spliced together the fake departure message that was left on the post office steps. Furthermore, Hamish knew that Mary had dressed carefully to meet someone she admired. Rab could never have lured Mary Kinnear out of her warm bed and down to the freezing slipway at dawn. The killer had used the telephone. The killer had spoken to Mary in the cultured, charming voice of Adrian Quill. Hamish walked away from Blair's loud accusations. He returned to the public telephone shelf mounted on the stone wall. He thought about the torn piece of the violet cassette label he had found caught in the wood. That was the crucial detail. The killer had used one of Adrian's highly confidential tapes to manipulate Myri. To do that, the murderer needed a deep, emotional motive. They needed unfettered access to Adrian's private recordings in the fog signal house. Above all, the killer required a high level of technical confidence with sound equipment to perfectly fake the voice of a dead man. Hamish looked up the wet stone path. The obvious suspect felt very solid until the actual science of sound knocked massive holes through him. Hamish traced the route the telephone line took from the Slipway. The public telephone was connected directly to the local exchange, and the local exchange for the entire hamlet was operated by the small switchboard located inside the Murnish post office. Chapter 8. The Woman in the Back Room. Hamish Macbeth spent Thursday morning sitting inside the gloomy, fluorescent-lit archive room of the Inverness Public Library. The journey to the city had taken 2 long hours through a driving Highland rain. Out in the car park, Lugs was currently sprawled completely flat across the passenger seat of the police vehicle, looking exactly like an old hearth rug left behind by a careless owner. Hamish stared at the glowing screen of a microfiche reader. His stomach gave a loud, hollow rumble. He had attempted to eat a plastic-wrapped cheese sandwich from the library vending machine an hour earlier. The bread had been stale, and the cheese tasted strongly of cardboard. He longed fiercely for a massive, steaming plate of rich Italian pasta from the Napoli restaurant back in Lochs. Even a slightly burnt fruit scone from Angela Brodie's chaotic kitchen would have been a massive improvement over city food. He forced his mind back to the glowing screen. Hamish was scrolling through regional newspaper records from 15 years ago. The village gossip network had provided the initial spark. Nessie Curry had been loudly complaining in the general store that Catriona Bell used to have a very posh voice before she moved north to hide in the post office. Hamish had decided to find out exactly where that voice had come from. After 30 minutes of scrolling, he found the small, black-and-white photograph. It was an article about a regional radio station in the south. The photograph showed a younger, brighter Catriona Bell sitting proudly in front of a massive, complicated audio mixing desk. The caption identified her as a senior studio assistant and continuity announcer. The brief article mentioned her incredible talent for editing sound and managing heavy broadcast equipment. Hamish sat back in the hard plastic chair. A cold realization washed over him, completely cutting through the stuffy heat of the library. Catriona had suffered a severe nervous collapse 14 years ago and retreated to the quiet isolation of Murnish Ferry. Adrian Quill, with his unnatural ability to read people, must have discovered her professional past. He had drawn her into his project. He had flattered her highly trained ear, her forgotten voice, and her lost professional pride. More importantly, Adrian had recorded a deeply personal interview with her. Hamish knew Adrian used his narrow, violet cassette labels with a clipped corner to mark those private confessions. Adrian had likely promised Catriona that her recording would remain completely secret. Hamish turned off the microfiche reader and drove quickly back to the coast. The weather had not improved. A harsh, freezing rain battered the windshield of the Land Rover. The thick mist rolled heavily down from the dark green hills, completely obscuring the black water of the sea loch. It was a perfect atmospheric pause, isolating the village of Murnish Ferry from the rest of the logical world. As Hamish parked near the harbour, he saw Sunsea dart across the wet stone wall. The fierce wildcat paused, fixing him with her wild yellow eyes, before she vanished into the deep, dripping heather. Hamish walked up the path to the post office. He pushed the door open. The little bell chimed brightly. Inside, Jessie Curry was buying a book of stamps. Jessie was functioning perfectly as the village chorus, eagerly repeating the terrible rumours that her sister Nessie had started that morning. "Rab Sutherland is packing his bags," Jessie announced loudly to the room. "Packing his bags entirely. Chief Inspector Blair is going to arrest him before supper. A terrible temper, that man has." Catriona Bell stood behind the counter, carefully counting out change. She looked incredibly pale, but her hands were perfectly steady. She nodded politely to Jessie and handed over the stamps. Hamish waited quietly by the door until Jessie hurried out into the rain, clutching her camel hair coat tight against the wind. "Good afternoon, Catriona." Hamish said gently, taking off his wet uniform cap. "May I step into the back for a moment?" Catriona hesitated, her eyes darting to the door, but she finally nodded and lifted the wooden counterflap. The cramped back sorting room smelled intensely of dry paper, old glue, and the metallic heat of a small electric kettle that never quite reached a proper boil. It was usually the warmest, safest room in the village. Today, it felt incredibly heavy. "I have been to Inverness," Hamish said softly. He stood near the small window, watching the rain strike the glass. "I went to the library." "I was reading about your time in regional radio, Catriona." The postmistress froze. She reached out and rested her hand against the edge of the sorting table. "That was a very long time ago, Constable. It has nothing to do with my life now." "I think it has everything to do with Adrian Quill," Hamish replied. He kept his voice low and entirely calm. "He found out about your past. He used it to flatter you. He made you feel like a professional again. And then he recorded your private story." Catriona stared down at the floorboards. She did not say a word. Hamish looked around the cluttered room. On a small wooden shelf above the kettle, he noticed a square cardboard box. It was filled with standard office supplies, loose rubber bands, and several plastic cassette cases. Hamish stepped closer to the shelf. Protruding from the top of the box were 3 distinct audio tapes. Each one bore a narrow, violet cassette label, and on every single label, one corner had been carefully clipped off with a pair of scissors. The trap completely closed in Hamish's mind. Catriona had not merely found one single tape on the fog signal house steps. She had taken all of Adrian's highly confidential recordings. She had kept the real private tapes hidden here in the back room. She was the only person in Murnish Ferry who possessed the technical knowledge to physically splice magnetic tape. She was the only one who could have built that fake departure message out of Adrian's old recorded phrases. Furthermore, as the postmistress, she had absolute control over the mail. She could easily claim that Adrian had left an envelope of cash for postage. She also controlled the local telephone switchboard. She could have plugged the tape machine directly into the line and played Adrian's recorded voice over the telephone, tricking Myri Kinnear into walking down to the freezing Slipway at dawn. Catriona was not just another lonely admirer. She was the only villager who could convincingly manufacture a dead man's voice. "You did not just listen to him, did you, Catriona?" Hamish asked quietly, looking directly at the violet cassette labels. "You helped him edit the main broadcast. You saw exactly what he was doing to the other women. You saw how he was twisting their words." Catriona closed her eyes. A single ragged breath escaped her lips. The warmest room in the village suddenly felt exactly like a trap lined with paper and terrible silence. Chapter 9. The Memorial Playback. The Murnish Community Hall was intensely draughty. A relentless, freezing Highland rain ticked heavily against the tin roof. The damp air smelled strongly of wet wool, floor wax, and the bitter scent of old tea leaves. It was a bleak, unforgiving atmosphere that completely isolated the small building from the rest of the dark world outside. Hamish Macbeth sat near the front row. He stared sadly at a paper plate holding 2 remarkably stale digestive biscuits. He would have gladly traded his entire week of wages for a massive, steaming bowl of rich pasta from the Napoli restaurant, or even a batch of Angela Brodie's notoriously heavy fruit scones. Anything would have been vastly superior to the depressing, dusty crumbs offered at village meetings, or the awful grey meat served at the Strathbane police canteen. Under his folding chair, Lugs was sprawled exactly like an old, discarded hearthrug. The dog was fast asleep, entirely ignoring the tense, nervous energy filling the crowded room. Outside, through the condensation on the high window panes, Hamish caught a brief glimpse of Sonsi. The wild cat sat on the slick stone sill. Her fierce, untamed yellow eyes stared into the bright hall for one long moment before she slipped silently away into the wet darkness. The entire village had gathered. Hamish had arranged this memorial listening evening under the strict pretext of playing Adrian Quill's final unfinished work. The Lochs gossip network had ensured an absolute full attendance. Nessie Curry sat in the second row, loudly informing Mrs. Wellington that Chief Inspector Blair was currently hunting for Rab Sutherland with heavy steel handcuffs. Jessie Curry nodded rapidly, her camel-hair coat still damp from the heavy rain. Suddenly, the wooden double doors at the back of the hall banged open. Detective Chief Inspector Blair barged into the room. He brought a strong, sharp smell of stale whiskey and strong peppermints with him. "Right, Macbeth," Blair shouted over the heads of the villagers. His face was a dark, furious red. "What is the meaning of this? This is an unauthorized gathering. I am conducting an official murder investigation." Hamish stood up slowly. He walked to the folding table at the front of the room. He did not raise his voice, but his quiet, calm tone immediately silenced the hall. "Please sit down, Mr. Blair," Hamish said gently. "I am about to conclude your investigation for you." Blair opened his mouth to roar an insult, but the absolute silence of the village made him hesitate. He crossed his thick arms and leaned against the back wall, sneering heavily. Hamish pressed the heavy play button on the large reel-to-reel tape machine. The warm, cultured voice of Adrian Quill filled the quiet room, announcing his sudden departure to London and asking for his equipment to be forwarded. Hamish let the tape run for 30 seconds. Then he pressed the stop button. The sudden silence was incredibly heavy. He manually rewound the tape a few inches and played it again. He stopped it, rewound it, and played it a third time. "Listen to the quiet hiss in the background of the room," Hamish told the villagers. "Listen to the sharp cut in his breath. Listen to the way the ends of the phrases do not match the beginnings." Young Niall Kerr nodded slowly from the third row. "Adrian Quill did not record this message," Hamish explained softly. "Someone built this departure out of old, discarded recordings. They spliced tiny pieces of magnetic tape together to manufacture a lie." Hamish reached into his uniform pocket. He pulled out a single plastic cassette case. He held it up under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Mr. Quill kept his most sensitive, highly confidential interviews marked with a specific sticker," Hamish said. He turned the plastic case so everyone could see the narrow violet cassette label. One corner of the violet label had been deliberately clipped off. He used this violet cassette label with its clipped corner to mark secrets he promised to keep private. Catriona Bell sat in the very front row. Her face was completely white. She stared straight ahead, completely rigid. Hamish reached into his other pocket. He pulled out the tiny, torn piece of sticky violet paper he had found on the slipway. He walked over to Catriona and gently placed both the cassette and the tiny scrap of paper on the empty chair beside her. The torn piece matched the clipped corner of the label perfectly. "You found out what he was doing, Catriona," Hamish said, his voice full of deep, quiet sadness. "He recorded your private grief. He promised to keep it safe, but you helped him edit the tapes, and you realized he was going to use your pain as the emotional centerpiece of his radio broadcast. You realized you were not his collaborator. You were just his material." The hall was perfectly silent. Even Blair had stopped sneering. "You argued with him late at night in the fog signal house," Hamish continued gently. "You struck him. And when he was dead, you used your old radio skills to splice his voice together. You posted his instructions, and you took all his private tapes back to the post office." Catriona closed her eyes. A single tear tracked slowly down her pale cheek. "But Myri Kinnear saw something," Hamish said. "Or perhaps she simply asked too many questions. So you plugged the tape machine into the local telephone switchboard. You used Adrian's recorded voice to summon Mary to the slipway at dawn. And when Myri arrived and realized the terrible truth, she became your second victim." The violet cassette label with its clipped corner tied the fake farewell, the hidden private tapes, and the luring of Myri into one single, devastating deception. Catriona Bell did not run. She did not scream or protest. She simply slumped forward in her folding chair, burying her face in her cold hands. She began to weep. A quiet, broken sound that echoed loudly in the draughty hall. No shouting was needed. The dead man's own voice had convicted the woman who had tried to borrow it. Chapter 10. After the hiss. The heavy rain finally lifted on Tuesday morning. A pale, cold sunlight broke through the clouds and touched the dark water of the sea loch. The freezing mist retreated back up into the high green hills. It was a peaceful, ordinary atmospheric pause that allowed the village of Lochdu to breathe again. The terrible tension of the past few days slowly evaporated into the clear air. Hamish Macbeth sat comfortably inside the Napoli restaurant. He was eating a massive, steaming plate of rich spaghetti covered in thick tomato sauce and heavy cheese. Willie Lamont hovered nervously nearby with a clean cloth, constantly wiping imaginary crumbs from the table. The food was a wonderful, deep comfort. It was vastly superior to the grey, watery stew served at the Strathbane police canteen, and it was certainly better than the sensible oats Priscilla had tried to force upon him. Under the table, Lugs was fast asleep. The dog was sprawled exactly like an old hearth rug, completely ignoring the clatter of plates and the loud chatter of the village. The gossip network of Lochdu had completely moved on from the tragedy in Muirnish Ferry. It had found a new, highly irritating target. Earlier that morning, Hamish had listened to Nessie Curry holding court by the tinned peaches in Patel's general store. Nessie held a copy of the regional newspaper. She loudly informed Mrs. Wellington that Detective Chief Inspector Blair had taken full credit for the entire investigation. Blair had given a boastful interview to a city reporter. The heavy Glasgow detective claimed he had solved the complex case using brilliant, aggressive interrogation tactics. He did not mention audio tape, violet cassette labels, or the careful observation of a local constable. Jessie Curry had echoed her sister, complaining bitterly about Blair's endless vanity. Hamish had simply bought his tea and walked away. He did not mind Blair taking the credit. Official praise only ever led to promotions, and Hamish wanted to remain exactly where he was. After finishing his wonderful meal, Hamish drove the Land Rover out to Muirnish Ferry. The small hamlet looked entirely ordinary again. The ferries were running back and forth across the water. The heavy, rhythmic sound of marine diesel engines replaced the tense, whispering silence of the previous week. Hamish stopped near the harbour wall to check on the residents. He found young Niall Kerr sitting on a wooden bench. Hamish sat beside him and spoke quietly. He assured the boy that his sharp ears had saved the village from a terrible injustice. He also promised Niall that his name would remain completely out of Blair's official police reports. Niall smiled, looking immensely relieved to be shielded from the terrifying spotlight of a murder trial. The women of Muirnish Ferry were slowly recovering from their deep embarrassment. They no longer queued outside the hairdresser. They wore their practical, warm coats and went about their daily chores. Hamish noticed that they spoke of Mary Kinnear with genuine kindness now. The cruel jokes about her pink blouse had completely stopped. Hamish walked back up the stone path toward the main road. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was standing near his police vehicle. She looked incredibly elegant, in a long wool coat, her golden hair perfectly smooth in the cold wind. "I heard the Strathbane police made an arrest," Priscilla said smoothly. "Mr. Blair is extremely proud of himself." "Mr. Blair is always proud of himself," Hamish replied mildly. Priscilla looked closely at Hamish. "You did a good thing, Hamish. But you are still completely determined to hide your intelligence. You cling to this rough, lazy life. You could be a senior detective in the city if you simply applied yourself and changed your habits." Hamish looked out over the black water. He thought about the sensible breakfast oats and the constant pressure to improve. "I like my life exactly as it is, Priscilla. The city is full of people trying to be important. I only want to be peaceful." Priscilla sighed, a quiet, frosty sigh. She simply could not understand why he resisted being polished into something better. They stood together in comfortable silence, speaking around the edges of their complicated relationship without truly resolving anything. Up on the edge of the ferry office roof, Sunsea appeared. The wildcat sat perfectly still against the pale sky. She watched the two humans with her fierce, untamed yellow eyes, looking entirely amused by their quiet, endless melodrama. Hamish tipped his uniform cap to Priscilla and climbed into his Land Rover. As he drove back along the coastal road, he thought about the handsome radio producer. Adrian Quill did not invent the profound loneliness in Muirnish Ferry. He had only found it, polished it with his charming attention, and made it sing until it finally broke. Restoration did not come in a grand triumph. It came in the simple relief of ordinary weather, ferries crossing the water, and honest voices speaking to each other again. Adrian Quill came north, promising to preserve voices before they were lost, and for a while that sounded almost noble. But there is a difference between listening to people and harvesting them. By the time Muirnish understood that difference, 2 of its own were dead, and everyone else was left sorting through the humiliation. That violet cassette label looked like nothing, just a fussy little way to sort tapes. Yet the clipped corner became the mark of the lie, because deceit usually leaves itself filed somewhere among ordinary things. To be heard is one of the deepest human hungers. But anyone who offers perfect understanding too quickly may not be giving comfort at all. Sometimes they are only choosing the best angle from which to use your sorrow. Still, ferries run, kettles boil, and even a village that has made fools of itself must post its letters, mend its nets, and nod to its neighbours in the rain. In the Highlands, dignity may take a knock, but stubbornness often brings it home again. What do you think is more dangerous? Being ignored for years, or suddenly being listened to by exactly the wrong person? Thank you for listening. Please leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe if you enjoyed the story. Join me next time for another dark secret hidden in the hills, right here on Highland Mystery. Good night.